Walk into a grocery store or mall in the USA with the communist hammer and sickle on your shirt. You might get some sideways glances. And maybe, depending on the people in the store and its location, you might get a comment or two. Come back the next day with a swastika. See what happens. Try another experiment. Wear a t-shirt with a picture of Josef Stalin. You will likely get the same reaction. Later, come back wearing a t-shirt with Hitler on it. You're not leaving that store without an incident. Why? Both were murderous, genocidal tyrants. And while Stalin did not construct camps with the express purpose of killing people on an industrial scale, his old-fashioned methods of a bullet to the back of the neck and working people to death in the camps of his GuLag labor camps are likely responsible for at least as many, and probably more, as those built by the Nazis. Most experts agree that the figure of 20 million dead is close. Many people in Russia today support Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine, as they did his attacks on Chechnya in the Second Chechen War in the early 2000s, his 2008 military involvement in the affairs of the independent nation of Georgia, Stalin's birthplace and former Soviet republic, and the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Why? Many believe that the Soviet Union, and therefore Russia, reached the height of its power and influence under Stalin, who ruled the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also called the USSR, or Soviet Union, from the late 1920s until he died in 1953. To these people, the 1990s, a decade in which Russia was racked by crime, drug addiction, and greed, was the result of Soviet leaders and their immediate successor, Boris Yeltsin's weakness and interference of the West, meaning primarily the United States. As the 90s went on and things got worse for most people instead of better, the succession of Putin to the presidency meant perhaps a return to a strong Russian leader who could tame crime and corruption. As time has gone by, Putin has made increasing references to Stalin, as have other Russian leaders. Among the people who support the war in Ukraine, Stalin's picture and symbols are valued as a symbol of returning Russian strength. There's a statistic often quoted, that every single family in the Soviet Union lost someone in the Great Patriotic War, as Russians call World War II. It's a much less quoted statistic that nearly every family, from the most powerful to the most poor, lost someone through the brutality of Stalin's rule. Western historians believe that in the internationally caused Ukrainian famine of the early 1930s, anywhere between 3 and 10 million people lost their lives as Stalin sought to weaken nationalistic feeling in what was at the time a Soviet republic. By the time of the famine in Ukraine, Stalin was in his 50s, but even as a young revolutionary in the pre-World War I Russian Empire, Stalin was committing crimes. The beginning. There almost seems to be a recipe for creating a dictator. Combine a strict, abusive, and many times alcoholic father with a doting, overprotective mother, and you get a Stalin, Hitler, Hussein, Ceausescu, and others. Stalin was born Josef Jukashvili in 1879 in Georgia, a remote part of the Russian Empire. His father, Bessarion Jukashvili, was a cobbler who drank and took out his anger and frustration on his wife and son. Stalin would have a hard childhood, not counting the abuse inflicted by his father. In infancy, he got smallpox, which left his face pockmarked for the rest of his life. At the age of 12, he was hit by a swiftly moving carriage, and his left arm remained virtually useless for the rest of his life. Two of Stalin's well-known qualities, toughness and willpower, were likely born from his childhood. When he was sent to the Russian Orthodox Seminary in the Georgian capital of Tiflis to become a priest, he was likely beaten, or at least given the paddle for any backtalk, serious errors, or misbehavior. Despite this, Stalin was a good student and became a locally known poet and writer in the first years of his 5-year stay in the seminary, which began in 1894. In the last year or so of his seminary career, Stalin became rebellious. He wasn't shy about telling the older monks and priests that they were wrong, or even stupid. He often snuck out of the seminary at night. For these and other infractions, he was often sent to a cell alone for days. In the spring of 1899, Stalin left the seminary and took a job as a junior meteorologist at the Tiflis Observatory. As you can imagine, this job and the solitary time it involved gave the curious Stalin time to read, and he was a voracious reader. The Russian Empire at the time was one of the last autocratic monarchies left in Europe, and it was also on its last legs for a variety of reasons, most, but not all, having to do with the extraordinary economic inequality of the kingdom. At the same time, workers in the rapidly developing industrial nations of Western Europe and, to a degree, the USA, were rebelling at their unequal economic status. The alternative to the Tsar in the Russian Empire and the radically one-sided economic system in the West was socialism, and its more radical cousin, communism. Stalin found communism appealing, and within a very short time of leaving the seminary, became involved in the communist movement. By 1905, protests and savage repression had begun to spring up all over Russia, making socialism and communism more appealing. Stalin threw in with the Bolsheviks, a radical minority of the Russian Socialist Democratic Labor Party, who followed the teachings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the fathers of modern communism. Though the party was spread nationwide with several local and regional leaders, the Bolsheviks drew their inspiration and instructions from Vladimir Ulyanov, known to history as Lenin. Stalin idolized Lenin and his teachings and became an integral part of the movement, especially in his home country of Georgia and the surrounding Caucasus territories. Any political party not allowed by the Tsar was illegal, so among the many problems faced by the Bolsheviks and other communists was funding. In the early 1900s, Stalin had a gang around him, all dedicated to one degree or other the communist cause. Stalin, or rather Joseph, took the name Koba as an alias. It came from a popular Georgian book called The Patricide, about corruption and social inequality in Georgia in the late 1800s. It's believed that Stalin and his men committed a series of bank robberies to raise money for the Bolsheviks. Still, his most famous exploit before coming to power was the 1907 daylight robbery of a stagecoach bringing cash to the largest bank in the Georgian capital. The attack happened on a busy street, and according to official sources, 40 people were killed and scores injured. The robbery had been organized not only by Stalin, but also by Lenin himself, as well as a few of Lenin's closest friends. Stalin and the other robbers escaped, and only one man was later brought to trial. By this time, Stalin was well known to the authorities, and he had already been living a life on the run for teaching the illegal theories and writings of Marx and Lenin. During his pre-Soviet life, Stalin was exiled or went into hiding at least 4 times, each time escaping for a period before being caught and exiled for another offense against the state. Bolshevik power. Government repression and inequality had existed in Russia since the first Tsars. However, under Nicholas II, a relatively intelligent but easily swayed man, these repressions and inequality increased. Despite the uprisings that occurred more frequently throughout the empire, more Russians still supported the Tsarist system. But the last straw came with Russia's entry into World War I. From almost the very start, the Russians began to suffer defeat after defeat at the hands of the Germans and Austrians, and by 1916, most of Ukraine and much of Western Russia were in enemy hands. The loss of Ukraine in particular hit hard. Then, as today, Ukraine is a major food supplier, not only to the regions around it, but to the world. First, the food needed by Russia's massive yet poorly equipped and led army took much of the food supply, not only from Ukraine, but throughout the country. Then, as the German-Austrian armies moved into the region, there was no food supply at all, especially in the big cities, like the then capital of St. Petersburg and the future capital, Moscow. Social unrest was greatest in these cities, though by 1917 the entire country was tired of war, famine, and the Tsarist system. A revolution broke out in February, and the Tsar was forced to abdicate. The provisional government, which was mildly socialist, was inept and did not pull Russia out of the war, as so many people demanded. In October, the Bolsheviks staged their own revolution in St. Petersburg and Moscow, overthrew the government, and executed the Tsar and his family. Within a few years, the Bolsheviks, who did not hesitate to use ruthless violence, even against other socialists, were solidly in power in most major cities in Western Russia. From 1917 to 1922, they fought a civil war with supporters of the Tsarist regime, an unbelievably bloody affair that cost the lives of millions, and were victorious. With the Bolsheviks firmly in power by the beginning of 1922 and Lenin weaker after suffering a stroke in May, Stalin slowly began making his move and accruing power behind the scenes. He presented himself to Lenin, the recognized head of state, as a loyal ally and servant. And for the most part, he was, and was appointed to position after position. The first position he was given in the Bolshevik movement was Commissar for Nationalities in 1917. In this position, Stalin oversaw the various minorities in the country. This position allowed him to build up a national network of allies and gave him an idea of the minority people who might wish to use periods of political instability as a time to secede. Two of these people were the Ukrainians and the Tatars. He held this position until 1923. From 1919 to 1923, he was Commissar for Workers' and Peasants' Inspection. This relatively minor post again allowed him to know, influence, or intimidate a wide variety of people throughout the largest nation in the world. Most important, though, was his appointment as General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party on April 3, 1922. This position gave him control of the party's most important leadership organization and meant that it ultimately was his decision who to name to various positions in the party, men in the military and the secret police, for example. When Lenin died from a second stroke on January 21, 1924, Stalin already had most of the power in the country, though many didn't realize it until it was too late. One of those was Leon Trotsky, one of Lenin's earliest supporters, one of the prominent Bolshevik theorists, and the leader of the Red Army during the Civil War. He also advocated strongly for world revolution, something that Stalin believed should be delayed until the country was on its feet. When Lenin died, his will criticized both Stalin and Trotsky, but ultimately he felt that Trotsky was his clear successor. In Lenin's mind, Stalin was a rude, boorish thug who had already gained too much power. It's a famous story. Stalin changed the will. All those in the know, except a few fortunate survivors, were later killed. Stalin's version of Lenin's will was that he was the successor, and Trotsky was the man to be removed. Trotsky was extremely popular with the people, but over the next 6 years, Stalin and his supporters launched a very public campaign against him. In 1927, Trotsky was thrown out of the Communist Party. In 1928, he was exiled in Central Asia. In February 1929, he was expelled from the country. In 1940, he was assassinated on Stalin's orders with an ice axe. Stalin's power. Between 1927, when Trotsky was expelled from the party, and 1938, when Stalin finished carrying out the largest and most violent purge of his reign, a huge propaganda campaign began to make Trotsky not only a traitor to Lenin and the USSR, but a stooge who had already been working for British, American, and German capitalists, among others. First, Stalin waged a campaign against Trotsky's known allies in the government and throughout the country. Tens of thousands of men and women were killed or sent to the GuLag, the system of prison labor camps built in remote regions throughout the country, primarily in frozen Siberia, where temperatures in winter could reach -40 below regularly. In the camp system of Kolyma in eastern Siberia, an estimated 1 million people perished. Though the Kolyma camp system was one of the largest, there were likely an additional 30,000 camps of all sizes in Stalin's Russia. In a combination of paranoia and a desire for complete power, Stalin began to see many of the old Bolsheviks, some of them longtime friends or acquaintances, as Trotskyites. And by the last part of the 1930s, he was strong enough in his position that he was prepared to act against them. The two most famous of dozens in the infamous Moscow show trials were Nikolai Bukharin and Grigory Zinoviev, longtime communists who were likely to be the people any opposition would rally around. Zinoviev, Bukharin, and others were arrested, tortured, had their families threatened, and were put on trial for treason and working against the revolution and Stalin. Newsreels filled the courtroom as the men were paraded in, where virtually everyone knew the verdict before the proceedings even started. Sometimes, Stalin sat up in a thinly curtained balcony, passing word down to prosecutors and judges about what should or should not happen. The most important thing for Stalin was that all who were accused confessed and signed a confession. That way, at least to the Soviet Republic, Stalin seemed right all the time. After signing their confessions, most of the time after hours or days under torture, Bukharin, Zinoviev, and the others were taken to prison and shot. In 1937, Stalin became suspicious of traitors in the army. Or perhaps he realized that the military was the only organization in the country that could threaten him. In the Red Army Purge of 1937-38, nearly 10% of the officers in the Red Army and Navy were killed or imprisoned, and then most likely killed. Not only were most of those killed the most intelligent and professional, but their deaths put the fear of God into the rest. By the end of 1938, Stalin owned the Red Army. The same type of thing occurred with frequency in the secret police, whose acronym, through most of Stalin's rule, was NKVD. At home, Stalin berated his second wife Nadezhda and likely beat her in drunken rages. His son Vasily was mistreated and ignored. In 1932, Nadezhda committed suicide. One of the most avoidable of Stalin's many abuses was the number of men killed in the construction of the White Sea Canal, which ran over 100 kilometers from the polar White Sea to Lake Onega to the south. More than 100,000 men lost their lives working in the sub-zero temperatures. Many of their bones are still there. Stopping construction for burial or disposal was forbidden. In the years leading up to 1932-33, ineptitude and corruption, combined with bad weather, resulted in poor harvests throughout the country. Though it was also hit by natural disasters, Ukraine remained relatively unscathed by these problems and was the Soviet Union's breadbasket until Stalin decided to get involved. Though Ukraine is a fertile land, it's the western part of the country, then a Soviet republic, that grows the most food. It's also the part closest to Europe, and most of the people were Catholic, rather than the Orthodox faith of most Russians. All of that and more led to a Ukrainian population, especially in the West, that was anti-Russian, anti-communist, and anti-Stalin to a degree. Whatever that degree was, Stalin wasn't happy. He needed Ukrainian grain to feed the cities where his power and support were strongest. What's more, the officials in charge of growing, counting, and reporting the harvests were afraid to tell Stalin that output was dropping. So instead, they increased the harvest on paper, which is what Stalin saw and believed. So Stalin not only ordered grain to be taken from the Ukrainians, but he took even more than he originally intended based on false reports written by people who were terrified of him. As a result, an estimated 2 to 3 million people in the Ukraine starved to death. The Tatar people in the Crimean region were another ethnic group tired of both Russian domination and communism. In the years leading up to World War II, Stalin had begun to target the leaders of the Tatar population. But no matter how many he killed, he kept hearing rumors of revolt. So he ordered the secret police and army to round up every Tatar they could find and scatter them into southern Central Asia. Trainloads of Tatars, reminiscent of the trains of victims of the Nazis, were shipped hundreds and hundreds of miles from their homes, many of whom died on the journey. In 1939, Stalin committed perhaps his biggest crime by signing a non-aggression pact with Hitler, dividing Poland and receiving the Baltic states, unwilling members of the former Russian Empire. In Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, known anti-communists, nationalists, intellectuals, and army officers were rounded up and shot. Most famously, Stalin personally signed the order commanding the death of 10,000 Polish army officers at Kacjan Forest in Poland. When Hitler violated the non-aggression pact, Stalin was shocked and for days refused to believe it was true. For over a week, the Red Army was paralyzed by inept officers or officers too afraid to do anything without orders directly from Stalin. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. At war's end, over 5 million Russian soldiers had been taken captive. Over 3 million were killed by the Nazis. Worse still, when they returned home, Stalin believed that captivity in Germany had infected them with Nazism, capitalism, or both, and a vast number of men who survived the war perished in Stalin's own camps. Think about that next time you see someone wearing a hammer and sickle or red star. This has been History on Fleek. See you next time.